Some stories feel like myths, tales of impossible odds, of sparks of genius that change the world forever. But what if the most legendary stories are the true ones? Welcome to Legendary True Stories, the podcast that uncovers the wisdom in the tales that shaped our history. I'm your host, Phil. Today we journey back to 19th century London, a city of soot and science, of rigid class structures and brilliant minds breaking free from them. Our story is about a boy born into poverty, with no formal education, who was destined to become one of the greatest scientists in history. This is the story of Michael Faraday, and how he discovered his spark of greatness. Michael Faraday's journey from poverty to scientific immortality. A wisdom story of perseverance, mentorship, and the power of curiosity. In the autumn of 1791, in a cramped cottage in Newington Butts, a small village that would later become part of South London, a child was born who would one day illuminate the world, quite literally. Michael Faraday entered this world not with fanfare or privilege, but into the harsh reality of poverty that would shape his character and fuel his determination for decades to come. His father, James Faraday, was a blacksmith whose weathered hands spoke of countless hours at the forge, yet whose failing health meant that steady work and steady income was never guaranteed. His mother, Margaret, possessed what neighbors called great calm and wisdom, a strength that would become young Michael's anchor through the storms of hardship that lay ahead. She was the kind of woman who could stretch a single loaf of bread to last a week, who could find hope in the darkest moments, and who taught her children that dignity was not determined by the coins in one's pocket. The Faraday household was one of 4 children, all competing for scraps in a world that seemed to have forgotten them. Michael would later recall, with the clarity that only true hunger can provide, being given one loaf of bread that had to sustain him for an entire week. A growing boy, his stomach gnawing with emptiness, carefully rationing each precious crumb, making it last through 7 long days and longer nights. This was not the romantic poverty of fairy tales, but the grinding, relentless kind that breaks spirits and crushes dreams before they can even take root. Yet in this crucible of hardship, something remarkable was being forged. The Faraday family belonged to a small Christian sect called the Sandemanians, a community that believed in the power of faith, simplicity, and mutual support. Every Sunday, young Michael would walk to the modest chapel in Paul's Alley, where he absorbed not just spiritual teachings, but lessons about perseverance, humility, and the belief that every person, regardless of their station in life, possessed inherent worth and potential. The Sandemanian faith would become the bedrock of Michael's character, teaching him that true greatness came not from worldly recognition or material wealth, but from service to others and the pursuit of truth. In a world that judged worth by social class and family connections, this small religious community offered a different vision, one where a blacksmith's son could dream of touching the stars. But dreams, as Michael would soon learn, required more than faith. They demanded action, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to learning, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The hunger for knowledge. At the age of 13, when most children from wealthy families were beginning their formal education in earnest, Michael Faraday's childhood came to an abrupt end. Economic necessity forced him into the working world, where he began delivering newspapers for a local book dealer and bookbinder named George Rebow. The irony was not lost on him. Here he was, a boy who had received only the most rudimentary education, learning to read and write in a church Sunday school, now surrounded by books that contained all the knowledge he desperately craved but could not afford to pursue. Most apprentices in Rebau's shop saw the books merely as objects to be bound, their contents as irrelevant as the weather. But Michael was different. Where others saw leather and paper, he saw doorways to understanding. Where others heard the monotonous rhythm of the binding press, he heard the whispered promises of discovery. During his lunch breaks and stolen moments throughout the day, Michael would carefully open the books brought in for rebinding, treating each page like a sacred text. He read voraciously, indiscriminately, hungrily, absorbing everything from poetry to philosophy, from history to science. But it was when he encountered the article on electricity in the third edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica that something inside him ignited. The words on those pages described a mysterious force that could travel through metal, that could create light and motion, that seemed to bridge the gap between the physical and the magical. For a young man who had grown up watching his father shape metal with fire and force, the idea that invisible energies could accomplish even greater transformations was nothing short of revolutionary. But Michael didn't just read about electricity. He experimented with it. Using old bottles discarded by local merchants and scraps of lumber from construction sites, he built his first crude electrostatic generator. Picture this scene: a teenage boy, his clothes patched and worn, working by candlelight in a cramped room, carefully assembling a device that most educated gentlemen of the time would have considered beyond their understanding. He constructed a weak voltaic pile, an early form of battery, and began conducting simple experiments in electrochemistry. These weren't the polished demonstrations of a university laboratory, but the desperate, passionate investigations of a young mind that refused to accept the limitations imposed by his circumstances. His fellow apprentices thought him odd, perhaps even touched in the head. Why waste time with such foolishness when there was honest work to be done? But Michael understood something they did not. Knowledge was not a luxury for the wealthy. It was a necessity for anyone who dared to dream of a different life. The moment that changed everything. In 1812, when Michael was 21 years old and nearing the end of his apprenticeship, fate presented him with an opportunity that would alter the course of his life forever. One of Rebau's customers, a gentleman who had noticed the young man's unusual intelligence and curiosity, offered him something more precious than gold: tickets to attend a series of chemical lectures by Sir Humphrey Davy at the Royal Institution of Great Britain. Sir Humphrey Davy was not merely a scientist. He was a celebrity, a man whose discoveries had made him famous throughout Europe, whose lectures drew crowds like a theatrical performance. He was everything that Michael was not: educated at the finest schools, connected to the most influential circles, knighted by the king himself for his contributions to science. To attend his lectures was to enter a world that seemed as distant from Newington Butts as the moon itself. But Michael went. He sat in that grand lecture hall, surrounded by gentlemen in fine coats and ladies in elegant dresses, and he absorbed every word that fell from Davy's lips. More than that, he took notes. Meticulous, detailed notes that captured not just the facts and formulas, but the passion and wonder that drove scientific inquiry. When the lecture series ended, Michael faced a choice that would define his future. He could return to bookbinding, accept his station in life, and content himself with reading about the discoveries of others. Or he could take a leap of faith that seemed almost impossibly audacious. He chose audacity. Michael spent weeks carefully transcribing his notes, binding them into an elegant volume that showcased both his bookbinding skills and his scientific understanding. Then, with the kind of courage that only comes from having nothing left to lose, he wrote a letter to Sir Humphrey Davy himself. The letter was a masterpiece of humility and determination. Michael didn't presume to claim equality with the great scientist, nor did he make demands or express entitlement. Instead, he simply asked for the chance to serve, to learn, to contribute in whatever small way he could to the advancement of human knowledge. "I am anxious to escape from trade," he wrote, "which I thought vicious and selfish, and to enter into the service of science, which I imagined made its pursuers amiable and liberal." The Mentor's Dilemma. When Sir Humphrey Davy received that carefully bound volume of lecture notes and read the accompanying letter, he faced his own moment of decision. Here was a young man of obvious intelligence and dedication, but one who came from the wrong class, who lacked the proper education, who had no connections or influence to recommend him. In the rigid social hierarchy of early 19th century England, such barriers were considered insurmountable. Science was the province of gentlemen, not the sons of blacksmiths. The Royal Institution was a place for the educated elite, not for apprentice bookbinders who had taught themselves chemistry from discarded volumes. But Davy was himself a man who had risen above his origins. Born in Cornwall to a middle-class family, he had climbed the social ladder through brilliance and determination. Perhaps he saw something of himself in this earnest young applicant, or perhaps he simply recognized that genius could emerge from the most unlikely places. Initially, there was no position available. Davy filed the letter away, but he did not forget it. Then, in a twist of fate that seemed almost too convenient to be true, one of Davy's laboratory assistants was dismissed for brawling. Suddenly, there was an opening. Davy sent word to Michael. If he was serious about his desire to serve science, there was a position available as a laboratory assistant. The pay was modest, the work would be demanding, and there was no guarantee of advancement. But for Michael, it was as if the gates of paradise had swung open. On March 1, 1813, Michael Faraday walked through the doors of the Royal Institution as its newest employee. He was 21 years old, poorly educated by conventional standards, and completely out of his social depth. But he carried with him something that no amount of formal schooling could provide: an insatiable curiosity and an unshakable determination to prove that greatness was not the exclusive province of the privileged. The Crucible of Character. Michael's first assignment as Davy's assistant was both an incredible opportunity and a profound humiliation. Sir Humphrey had been invited to undertake a grand tour of the European continent, visiting the great scientific centers of France, Italy, and Switzerland. It was a journey that would expose him to the leading minds of the age, allow him to witness cutting-edge experiments, and establish connections that would benefit his career for decades to come. Davy invited Michael to accompany him, not as a colleague or even as a student, but as a servant. Michael would be responsible for managing the luggage, preparing the equipment for demonstrations, and, most degradingly of all, serving as a personal valet to Lady Davy, Humphrey's aristocratic wife. Lady Davy made no secret of her disdain for this arrangement. To her, Michael was nothing more than a common servant who had somehow wormed his way into her husband's good graces. She treated him with the casual cruelty that the privileged often reserve for those they consider beneath their notice, demanding that he perform menial tasks that had nothing to do with science or learning. A young man who had dreamed of intellectual discourse and scientific discovery, instead finding himself polishing boots and carrying bags, enduring the condescending remarks of a woman who saw him as little more than a piece of furniture. Many would have quit, returned to London with their dignity intact and their illusions shattered. But Michael endured. He understood that this humiliation was the price of admission to a world that would otherwise remain forever closed to him. While he performed his servant's duties, he also observed, learned, and absorbed everything around him. He watched Davy conduct experiments with the leading scientists of Europe. He saw how knowledge was shared and debated among the intellectual elite. He began to understand that science was not just about facts and formulas, but about a way of thinking, a method of questioning the world that could be applied to any problem. Most importantly, he learned about resilience. Every slight from Lady Davy, every moment of humiliation, every reminder of his lowly status, became fuel for his determination. He would not just survive this experience, he would transform it into the foundation of his future greatness. The tour lasted 18 months, and when Michael returned to London in 1815, he was a changed man. He had seen the wider world of science, had witnessed the passion and dedication of the greatest minds of his generation, and had proven to himself that he could endure any hardship in pursuit of his dreams. The student becomes the scientist. Back at the Royal Institution, Michael threw himself into his work with renewed vigor. Under Davy's guidance, he began to master not just the techniques of experimental chemistry, but the deeper principles that govern the natural world. Davy was a demanding teacher, but also a generous one, sharing not just his knowledge but his approach to scientific thinking. From Davy, Michael learned that chemistry was not merely about mixing substances and observing reactions. It was about understanding the fundamental forces that held matter together, the invisible bonds that could be broken and reformed to create entirely new substances. Davy introduced him to the revolutionary idea that chemical properties were determined not just by the elements present in a compound, but by how those elements were arranged, a concept that would prove crucial to Michael's later discoveries. But perhaps most importantly, Davy taught Michael to think in terms of forces and fields. Drawing on the atomic theory of Ruggero Giuseppe Boscovich, Davy explained that atoms were not solid particles but mathematical points surrounded by alternating fields of attractive and repulsive forces. This seemingly abstract concept would later become the foundation of Michael's revolutionary understanding of electricity and magnetism. As Michael's skills developed, so did his confidence. He began to conduct his own experiments, first under Davy's direct supervision, then with increasing independence. In 1820, he produced the first known compounds of carbon and chlorine, a discovery that established his reputation as a chemist in his own right. But it was in 1821 that Michael made the discovery that would change his life and create the first serious rift with his mentor. The birth of the electric motor. The year 1821 was a time of extraordinary excitement in the scientific world. Hans Christian Ørsted had recently announced his discovery that an electric current flowing through a wire could deflect a magnetic compass needle, proving for the first time that electricity and magnetism were related phenomena. André-Marie Ampère had followed up with experiments showing that the magnetic force around a current-carrying wire appeared to be circular. These discoveries had set the scientific community ablaze with speculation and experimentation. What was the exact nature of this relationship between electricity and magnetism? Could it be harnessed for practical purposes? Could magnetic forces be used to create motion? Michael approached these questions with the methodical precision he had learned from Davy, but also with an intuitive understanding that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than formal education. If the magnetic force around a wire was indeed circular, he reasoned, then it should be possible to make a magnet move continuously around that wire, or conversely, to make the wire move around a fixed magnet. Working in the basement laboratory of the Royal Institution, using equipment he had largely built himself, Michael constructed a simple but elegant apparatus. He placed a wire carrying an electric current near a permanent magnet, arranged so that the magnetic force would cause continuous circular motion. On September 3, 1821, Michael Faraday created the world's first electric motor. It was a crude device by modern standards, little more than a wire spinning around a magnet in a bowl of mercury. But it represented something revolutionary. Period. The conversion of electrical energy into mechanical motion. For the first time in human history, the invisible force of electricity had been harnessed to create useful work. Michael published his results on October 1, 1821, to immediate acclaim from the scientific community. Here was a discovery that was not just theoretically interesting, but practically significant. The implications were staggering. If electricity could create motion, then perhaps the age-old dream of mechanical power without steam or muscle was within reach. But within a week of publication, Michael began hearing disturbing rumors. People were saying that he had stolen the idea from others, that he had plagiarized the work of more established scientists. And leading the chorus of accusation was the one person whose support he most needed, Sir Humphrey Davy himself. The mentor's jealousy. The relationship between Michael Faraday and Humphrey Davy had always been complex, shaped by differences in class, education, and social standing. Davy had been Michael's benefactor, his teacher, his gateway into the world of science. But he had also been his superior, the established scientist who had graciously allowed a blacksmith's son to work in his laboratory. Now suddenly, the dynamic had shifted. Michael's discovery of electromagnetic rotation was being hailed as one of the most significant scientific breakthroughs of the decade. Newspapers were writing about the young assistant who had unlocked the secrets of electricity. The Royal Society was taking notice of this remarkable talent who had emerged from nowhere. For Davy, this represented a profound threat. He had spent years building his reputation as Britain's leading scientist, had been knighted for his contributions to chemistry, had become accustomed to being the center of scientific attention. Now his former assistant, a man he had plucked from obscurity, a man who owed everything to his patronage, was threatening to eclipse him. The accusations of plagiarism were particularly painful because they contained a grain of truth. Davy and his colleague William Wollaston had indeed been working on similar experiments, trying to create rotational motion from electromagnetic forces. They had not succeeded, but they had been pursuing the same general line of inquiry. Michael wrote desperately to Wollaston, seeking to clear his name. "I am anxious to escape from unfounded impressions against me, and if I have done any wrong, that I may apologize for it." Wollaston, to his credit, responded graciously, claiming to be unoffended and telling Michael that he had no occasion to concern yourself much about the matter. But Wollaston's private forgiveness was not enough to stop the public attacks. Davy continued to question Michael's originality, to suggest that he had appropriated ideas that belonged to others. The man who had once been Michael's greatest supporter had become his most dangerous critic. The situation was made worse by the class dynamics that had always lurked beneath the surface of their relationship. Davy, despite his own middle-class origins, had been fully accepted into the aristocratic world of British science. He had been knighted, had married into the upper classes, had learned to navigate the complex social hierarchies that governed intellectual life. Michael, by contrast, remained an outsider. His accent marked him as working class. His lack of formal education was obvious to anyone who spoke with him for more than a few minutes, and his religious beliefs set him apart from the Anglican establishment that dominated British science. In Davy's mind, Michael's success represented a dangerous precedent. If a blacksmith's son could achieve scientific greatness without the proper breeding and education, what did that say about the natural order of things? What did it mean for the carefully maintained barriers that separated the gentlemen of science from the common masses? The strength to persevere. Lesser men might have been crushed by such attacks, especially coming from someone they had trusted and admired. The scientific world was small and tightly knit. Davy's opposition could have effectively ended Michael's career before it had truly begun. But Michael Faraday was not a lesser man. The same poverty that had taught him to stretch a loaf of bread for a week had also taught him the value of persistence. The same humiliation he had endured as Lady Davy's servant had strengthened his resolve to prove his worth through achievement rather than birth. Instead of retreating or seeking revenge, Michael chose a different path. He focused on his work, allowing his discoveries to speak for themselves. He maintained his respect for Davy as a scientist, even while defending himself against unfair accusations. He understood that greatness was not achieved through conflict, but through contribution. This period of trial revealed the true depth of Michael's character. He could have become bitter, could have allowed resentment to poison his relationship with science itself. Instead, he used the criticism as motivation to work even harder, to be even more careful in his methods, to ensure that his future discoveries would be so thoroughly documented and so clearly original that no one could question their authenticity. The Sandemanian faith that had sustained him through childhood poverty now provided a different kind of strength. His religious beliefs taught him that true worth came not from worldly recognition, but from service to truth and humanity. The attacks on his reputation were painful, but they could not touch the deeper satisfaction he found in understanding the natural world. Michael also drew strength from his marriage to Sarah Barnard, whom he wed in 1821 at the height of the controversy. Sarah was a fellow Sandemanian, a woman who understood his values and supported his dedication to science. She provided the emotional stability and domestic peace that allowed him to focus on his research, despite the professional turmoil surrounding him. The triumph of persistence. As the 1820s progressed, Michael's reputation gradually recovered and then soared. His continued discoveries in chemistry and physics made it impossible for even his critics to deny his genius. In 1825, when Davy's health began to fail, Michael was appointed director of the laboratory at the Royal Institution, a position that effectively made him Davy's successor. The irony was not lost on either man. The assistant who had once been accused of stealing ideas was now leading the institution where those accusations had been made. But Michael handled his elevation with characteristic grace, never gloating over his former mentor's decline, never using his position to settle old scores. In 1831, Michael made perhaps his greatest discovery: electromagnetic induction. He found that a changing magnetic field could induce an electric current in a nearby wire, effectively reversing his earlier discovery of electromagnetic rotation. If electricity could create magnetism, then magnetism could create electricity. This discovery laid the foundation for the modern electrical age. Every generator that powers our cities, every transformer that steps voltage up or down, every electric motor that drives our machines, all trace their lineage back to that moment in 1831 when Michael Faraday first observed the mysterious dance between electricity and magnetism. But perhaps even more significant than the discovery itself was what it represented: a new era in space exploration, the triumph of curiosity over prejudice, of merit over privilege, of persistence over adversity. Here was a man who had been born into poverty, who had been denied formal education, who had been attacked by his own mentor, yet who had persevered to unlock some of the deepest secrets of the natural world. The teacher and the legacy. As Michael's fame grew, he never forgot the struggles of his early years or the importance of sharing knowledge with others. In the mid-1820s, he founded two institutions that would become legendary in the world of science education: the Friday evening discourses and the Christmas lectures. The Friday evening discourses were designed to bring cutting-edge science to the educated public, to break down the barriers between researchers and the broader community. But it was the Christmas lectures that truly revealed Michael's character and values. These lectures were specifically designed for young people, particularly those from backgrounds similar to his own. Michael understood that there were countless bright minds trapped in poverty and ignorance, young people who possessed the same curiosity and potential that had driven him, but who lacked the opportunities to develop their talents. Standing before audiences of children and teenagers, Michael would demonstrate the wonders of science with the same passion and clarity that had once captivated him in Davy's lectures. He showed them that the natural world was not a collection of dry facts to be memorized, but a vast puzzle waiting to be solved, a source of endless wonder and discovery. Nothing is too wonderful to be true, he would tell them, if it be consistent with the laws of nature. This was more than a scientific principle. It was a philosophy of life, an encouragement to dream beyond the limitations of circumstance and to believe that understanding was possible for anyone willing to observe, question, and persist. Michael's lectures were not just about chemistry and physics. They were about the power of human curiosity and the importance of never giving up on one's dreams. He spoke to his young audiences not as a distant authority figure, but as someone who understood their struggles, who had faced the same barriers and overcome them through determination and hard work. The humble giant. Despite his growing fame and influence, Michael Faraday remained remarkably humble throughout his life. He was twice offered the presidency of the Royal Society, the highest honor in British science, but declined both times. He publicly stated that he would not accept a knighthood, believing that such worldly honors were inconsistent with his religious principles and his commitment to science for its own sake. This humility was not false modesty, but a genuine reflection of his character and values. Michael understood that his discoveries were not personal achievements, but contributions to the collective human understanding of the natural world. He saw himself not as a great man, but as a faithful servant of truth, someone who had been blessed with the opportunity to glimpse the hidden workings of creation. His laboratory notebooks reveal this attitude clearly. They are filled not with boastful claims or self-congratulation, but with careful observations, honest admissions of uncertainty, and genuine excitement about the mysteries yet to be solved. Even his greatest discoveries are recorded with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who sees himself as merely the instrument through which nature reveals its secrets. This humility extended to his relationships with others. Despite the attacks he had endured from Davy, Michael never spoke ill of his former mentor. He understood that Davy's jealousy came from human weakness, not malice, and he chose to remember the positive aspects of their relationship rather than dwelling on the painful conflicts. When young scientists sought his guidance, Michael was generous with his time and knowledge, just as he hoped others would be with the next generation. He understood that science was not a competition, but a collaboration across time, with each generation building on the discoveries of those who came before. The final years and eternal impact. As Michael aged, his mind began to show the effects of a lifetime of intense intellectual labor. He suffered periods of memory loss and confusion, a cruel irony for a man whose greatest gift had been his ability to see connections that others missed. But even in decline, his essential character remained unchanged. In 1858, Queen Victoria provided him with a Grace and Favour house at Hampton Court, a recognition of his contributions to British science and a comfortable retreat for his final years. He died there on August 25, 1867, at the age of 75, surrounded by the books and instruments that had been his constant companions. But Michael Faraday's true legacy was not in the honors he received or the positions he held. It was in the fundamental transformation of human understanding that his discoveries had made possible. The equations that James Clerk Maxwell developed to describe electromagnetic phenomena were built directly on Michael's experimental work. The electrical age that followed, with its lights and motors, its telegraphs and radios, its computers and smartphones, all trace their origins to that moment when a blacksmith's son first made a wire spin around a magnet. More than that, Michael's life story became a testament to the power of human potential. He proved that greatness was not the exclusive province of the privileged, that curiosity and determination could overcome any barrier, that the most profound discoveries could emerge from the most humble beginnings. The eternal lesson. Today, as we flip a switch to illuminate a room or start a car with an electric motor, we are witnessing the practical application of principles that Michael Faraday discovered nearly 2 centuries ago. But the deeper lesson of his life transcends any particular scientific achievement. Michael Faraday's story teaches us that every person, regardless of their background or circumstances, possesses the potential for greatness. It shows us that mentorship, even flawed and complicated mentorship, can open doors that would otherwise remain forever closed. It demonstrates that setbacks and criticism, rather than destroying us, can become the fuel for even greater achievements. Most importantly, it reminds us that true success is not measured by wealth or status or recognition, but by the contribution we make to the sum of human knowledge and happiness. Michael Faraday died a relatively modest man by the standards of his time, but his discoveries continue to light the world and power our civilization. In our own lives, when we face obstacles that seem insurmountable, when critics question our abilities, when the path forward seems unclear, we can draw inspiration from the boy who stretched a loaf of bread for a week and grew up to unlock the secrets of electricity. We can remember that curiosity is more powerful than privilege, that persistence can overcome prejudice, and that the spark of greatness lies within each of us, waiting only for the courage to pursue it. The story of Michael Faraday is ultimately a story about the triumph of the human spirit. It reminds us that in a world that often seems divided by class and circumstance, the pursuit of truth and understanding can unite us all. It shows us that the greatest discoveries come not from those who have everything handed to them, but from those who refuse to accept the limitations that others would impose upon them. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches us that the true measure of a life is not what we achieve for ourselves, but what we make possible for others. Michael Faraday's greatest discovery was not electromagnetic induction or the electric motor. It was the proof that anyone from any background can contribute to the grand human project of understanding our universe. In the end, that may be the most inspiring lesson of all, that each of us carries within ourselves the potential to light up the world, if only we have the courage to let our curiosity shine. Nothing is too wonderful to be true, if it be consistent with the laws of nature. Michael Faraday. Faraday's spark of greatness illuminated the entire globe. He proved that one person's mind can reshape the physical world, for all of humanity. But what is true power? Is it the power to command armies? The power to invent? Or is it the power to remain calm and virtuous when you have nothing? Next week, we explore a different kind of greatness. We'll tell the story of a man who was born into slavery, whose leg was intentionally crippled by his master, and who possessed nothing to his name. Yet he would become one of history's most influential philosophers on the art of living. How can a man in chains teach the world what it means to be free? Find out in our next episode, The Stoic Slave Who Mastered Wisdom. What spark are you fanning in your own life? Join us next time for another legendary true story.